we're now being recorded. So, so I better get on with things. Brought everyone here today to have a discussion around the paper that Amy and Kieran co-wrote around autistic people and their habit of masking, as it may be, and conceptualizing this. So over to you both.
Okay.
Thank you, Samuel.
Do you want me to start off and then?
Yeah.
Yeah, cool. Okay. So just to say, we don't have any slides. The plan was just to kind of talk a little bit about the background for the paper, so why we kind of focused on the areas that we did, and where we think that needs to go in future, and what we think the problems are really with the ideas around masking, and why we're both very frustrated at the research and kind of the ideas there at the moment. And then what we're hoping is that people could kind of engage and ask questions and things and have a bit more of an interactive session, because obviously with it not being an empirical study, we don't have any data or anything like that to show you. So for those of you who maybe are a little bit less familiar with either or both of us, I am a lecturer at the University of Sunderland. Kieran is an excellent advocate, trainer, consultant, does various things. And we met a couple of years ago for a coffee and kind of quickly started sharing lots and lots of thoughts around research in neurodiversity and autism. And one of the things that we discussed at length was masking. Kieran has wrote extensively on masking in the blog that he has, the autisticadvocate.com. And we were both really frustrated with ideas around masking and the suggestion that masking is really grounded in strategy. The idea for the paper came about in regards to, we kind of kept discussing literature and ideas around what masking or camouflaging, it's often referred to in other academic literature, in the way that it's described. So it's this kind of, you know, trifecta of masking, compensation, and assimilation, and that's the model. And you know, that's it. We've discovered the ways in which autistic people can hide their autisticness from other people. And Kieran and I were talking about this at length, and I had some data from a study that has just come out in the past couple of weeks called Masking is Life, looking at masking in autistic and non-autistic adults. And I was talking to Kieran about the data from this and about the coding, and we were saying, like, this seems really complex, like a lot more complex than we've seen in the literature so far. And also there's a real lack of social theory. Like, a lot of these things we found relate to concepts that I've seen discussed and have read about at length in the social literature. So about things like identity, and particularly social identity. So how we align ourselves with other people, how we monitor our own behaviors, how we try and avoid things like stigma, which, you know, Damien's been writing about for years. And we're kind of talking about how a lot of this was missing. And then we saw a call for the State of the Science special issue in autism and adulthood, and that was kind of the kick up the butt that we needed to actually put these thoughts into writing. So what we really wanted to do with the paper was discuss what we think the key issues are in this research area so far. One of the main things I think that we have a particular issue with is the suggestion that masking is mostly kind of conscious, and that it is grounded in a need to, or a desire to fit in with other people. Autistic people, contrary to some popular belief, are human, and humans do tend to want to align themselves with each other, to fit in, to find like-minded or similar others, and to form relationships with them. That is a human behavior. But masking often seems to be more multifaceted than that. We use lots of different words when we talk about masking, things like camouflaging, masking, concealment, adaptive morphing, when Lawson has referred to it as. And all of these are grounded in the social sphere, but we don't talk about them as social. So we really wanted to address that. The other thing we really wanted to take aim at was the idea that masking is a female thing, that it's something that women do because we're better at being social, regardless of whether we're autistic or not. Women are just hardwired to be social and empathic, and that somehow makes us differently autistic. It doesn't really take into account the differences in socialization that you might go through if you're assigned female at birth, and it very much erases the experience of men, non-binary autistics, and anyone who doesn't fit with very binary ideas. So that's kind of where we came from. And I am going to stop talking now and let Kieran speak. I've had so much coffee.
I was going to say, how much coffee have you had today?
A lot.
And are still drinking it as well.
Mhm.
Yeah, so I think Amy's covered most of the kind of the main points, the thrust of why we wanted to do it. Very much around the issue around gender. Was something I was really keen to address. But also as well, I think something that Amy hasn't touched on as much there is that I look at masking in not only in a social capacity, but in a developmental capacity as well. And that's something else we wanted to go over in the paper about how much developmental trauma plays into this. And that's really kind of framed around the key things around how much of it is unconscious and how much of it is conscious. And that's really hard for researchers to dig into, because when you're talking to someone who engages in masking and maybe doesn't have a great understanding of themselves or their autistic selves in any kind of degree, if you are masking, you dissociate from the act. So it's really hard to answer questions. So that was one of the biggest things. And also the fact that most of this research has been done by non-autistic people, by non-autistic researchers. So again, there's a problem there in terms of, if this is, Damien's double empathy theory, if you have not engaged in something like this, or this isn't a part of your life, how then can you ask the right questions in order to be able to frame it properly and also make the right inferences from the answers that you get? So these are all kind of really key things. And the last thing that I was really keen to look at as well was the fact that this isn't just an autistic behavior. That when you look at literature from other marginalized groups, all those marginalized groups discuss masking in various forms and under different names. So there might be things that are specific to autistic people in the way that we do it, and the reasons that we do it might be specific to us. But the fact is that this exists across different marginalized groups. So it was really key for us to put that in there as well, to say that actually, this is comparable about how people are being treated and how they're reacting to being treated. And the last thing I wanted to say there as well is actually what Amy said about this notion of fitting in. And I think there's been a massive misinterpretation by non-autistic researchers in the way that we talk about masking, because when we talk about fitting in, I think there's been a bit of an appeal to the ego of non-autistic researchers, and in terms of, well, why wouldn't you want to be like us? When in actual fact, it isn't about that at all. It's about a reaction of we fit in for safety, and that's where the trauma comes into this. So there's so many multiple levels here, and all the while through the paper we had a little mini Damien on our shoulders saying Goffman, and and then we started looking into other sociologists who talked about identity really deeply, Webb Du Bois and so many others as well. And actually these are things that have been discussed, as Damien will tell us, for a very long time, but haven't been attributed to autistic people before. So yeah, so that was my little coffee outburst.
So I think some of the major issues we really wanted to address here, and I think it's important to kind of get out of the way that these issues we obviously think are important, but I think it's important that this reaches kind of a wider audience in terms of, I think the way research is being framed and will continue to be framed is missing the point a little bit. So research that looks at the relationship between things like poor mental health outcomes and masking, for instance, and finds that autistic people who report higher levels of masking also tend to report higher symptoms of depression and anxiety. And it's like, wow, masking causes depression and anxiety. And it's like, well, no, like if someone trips you over and you fall and skin your knee, you don't blame the floor for the knee getting skinned. Everyone's like, well, you wouldn't have fallen if you weren't tripped. And it's the same with this stigma that leads people to engage in masking, in that if people treat you like other, they treat you like you are weird or quirky, depending on how endearing they find your personality. If you're treated like you're different from other people, then you start to internalize those ideas. You start to think a lot about yourself and where you fit in and what your place is. And consciously or unconsciously, you might start to modify how you act around other people, and you might start to internalize some of those views that other people have of you. And autistic people do that. The reason there has been so little focus on it is because research into autistic social behavior is pretty non-existent from a non-neuronormative point of view. There's work, like limited work. So obviously Damien's work, you know, and then work starting to come out now from like Catherine Crompton and Noah Sasson, looking into ways in which autistic people make social judgments, and the way in which autistic people socialize with each other within neurotype communication. But up until what, 10 years ago, the prevailing view that is still held by a lot of people is that autistic people are mind blind, that they're not interested in other people. And when you believe that people aren't interested in other people, why would you think that people engage in social strategies? So I think that's something we really wanted to dig into, and yeah, suggest that masking it's not something new and snazzy, and it's not autistic people having this special sneaky power that prevents clinicians from identifying them. It's that autistic people are stigmatized, and masking or concealment or whatever you want to call it is a form of stigma avoidance. Now, that's not the case always. We all mask in various ways. If we're taking masking as a purely kind of social strategy, we might monitor our social behavior in various ways in different social situations, which is something we also talk about. And there's really a lack of research into context switching and identity on autistic people, which we are currently trying to do a little bit of work on. And we have a little bit of funding to look at that with people in kind of a two-part study, also looking at monotropism. But yeah, everyone context switches, or at least we think everyone context switches, but we don't know much about the experience of that in autistic people. It's likely that most of us switch how we speak to our boss, for instance, or maybe not me personally because I have a really informal boss, but for most people, they might act different, you know, with their line manager versus their partner versus their friends at football versus their friends from painting class. I'm terrible at thinking of examples on the spot, but we have different aspects to ourselves that we show in different situations. And I don't think autistic people are any different in that regard. Again, we're human. We show the same kinds of individual differences that you see in other populations. But yeah, we don't know anything about that. And so when we make kind of grand sweeping statements about what masking or camouflaging isn't, without knowing anything about the social structures to start off with, then it's very easy to be conceptually limited in how you interpret what people say or interpret the data coming out of studies.
I think there's also an element of responsibility here from academia as well, because as we all know, services are driven by academic research. So, you know, certain things filter through and certain things get more kind of traction than others. And as someone with an education background, I see this a lot in the way that teachers are now starting to talk about masking. The fact that they are is a good thing, but they've literally gone off on this narrative of it is a social strategy, it is only present in girls, and that girls are being missed because they're hiding, which is very much not the reality of the situation, obviously. And something that maybe that I would like to go, if we follow up on this paper, which I would hope that we do at some point, I would like to delve a little bit deeper into what is assumed to be masking and what actually isn't, because it's the lack of knowledge from people around autistic people that then encourage them to blame us from hiding from them, when in actual fact they're not seeing what they're supposed to be seeing, or they're not looking for the right things anyway. So yeah, so there's obviously, we had a short amount of words to write an awful lot, and I think we could probably turn it into several books, to be perfectly honest, because there's just so much there. But that's why we wanted to do it. We literally wanted to put a stop to where the research was going now, or at least hold up a kind of a stop sign and say, can we think about this a little bit more deeply and move beyond it just being strategies?
And also stop using the term compensation.
Yes, because it's very ableist.
Just to address the elephant in the room, like that, the assumption that we aim for neuronormativity, like compensating for what, even if the thought behind it is about the use of a non-native communication strategy or non-native cognitive strategy, just say that. Yeah. Okay.
I've been making some notes here because there's quite a few issues in a way I'd like to pick up on myself. Because as you mentioned a fair bit, I've been working in this area for some time in many ways, and there's so many issues, as well as you've both said, that one could talk about and relate to this. But there's some which I think are worth delving into a little bit more. There's one aspect is this current research which is being done on this area, and as you know, I've been quite pained by it over the time, and the lack of references to sociological thinkers and this wider context, which for a sociologist would seem obvious, because it's a part of what we're trained in a sense, these theories and ideas, and how it got related to a kind of female type of autism or phenotype. And there was this article in Spectrum magazine by Von Bone or something, talking about this is not specific to autistic women and things. It's like, well, no, it never has been. It's more specific to stigma responses, which is exactly what your articles argue. And yes, there's other reasons for masking or passing and so on, other than stigma response, but this is the main driver for it and always has been, in my view. And it was amazing to me when I first started looking at the autism literature, how people were talking about social interaction, yet nobody was referencing Goffman or Garfinkel. Or another one was Howard Becker and internalizing the negative connotations of others and seeing oneself from that viewpoint, or even subverting it. He wrote about in the early 60s. And similar sort of time to Goffman. So terms like internalized depression have been around in disability studies for a very long time. And it seems on this topic that the only people who seem to be writing about it almost in this way seems to be coming from autistic authors, or in the main. And it only seems now that a few others are starting to pick up on it. So what do you think of the CAT-Q questionnaire?
Would
A
you like
load
the
of
light
questions.
answer?
Do you want to go first?
Yeah, I think one of my biggest issues with the CAT-Q is that it's not measuring masking, which it's claiming to be, or social camouflaging, as they call it. It's measuring social anxiety, in my opinion, and I think there are better measures of social anxiety, to be honest. But I think because it's come from the same place as a lot of where this research has come from, which has got a lot of traction, it's been given a lot of credence as well at the same time. And I just find it massively problematic in so many different ways.
Yeah, me too. I
I
think,
think. Oh, go ahead.
sorry, it's kind of factor analysis type of thing ends up being quite circular, and there's a confirmatory bias to it, to the researcher's own viewpoint and what they're looking at. And I would say similar about the AQ test. And the autism research field seems full of these psychometric questionnaires, but designed from a non-autistic viewpoint, reconfirming their own biases. It's rather frustrating that a questionnaire of this sort can only indicate so much anyway. It's kind of that the amount of this work out there is a bit worrying. Another thing I picked up on at the end there was context switching, because Goffman talked about this in his first book, Presentation of Self in Everyday Life, and how everyone's kind of masking all the time and switching between roles. There's a good episode of Blackadder, if you remember, going for people of my generation. You can look it up, where he's having to negotiate between two different sets of people who arrive at his house at the same time. One's a drunken sort of group who he's meant to get drunk with and party with, and the other group's like the church bishop or what have you. And he's got one lot in one room and one in another, trying to context switch between. So it's, yeah, quite good stuff to look up. There's a comedy version of that. But I would think autistic people on monotropic tendencies and so on, task switching or changing tracks from one context to another or one role to another might be quite tricky, unless you just play one general role the whole and don't shift so much, which is one strategy. It'd be interesting to see where your work goes in that direction. Don't know if you want to say any more on that.
Yeah, so we've started collecting the data, and that it's very much that's my viewpoint on it. And I think there's also something there around recognition of hierarchy and authority as well. At least for me,
I think there'll be something around that.
Yeah, like recognizing how to speak to people of different levels of hierarchy is like, no. But yeah, so we can't say too much about the way in which we're measuring monotropism, just because if anyone does want to take part, telling you would completely defeat the purpose of the thing that we're doing. There's no deception involved. It's just a task making judgments about the way something looks. But yeah, a bit more data on that at a later point. But we're doing some interviews around identity. So looking at kind of the way in which people consider their identity in different contexts and trying to gather kind of some really depthful qualitative data around that. So we've started collecting interviews, and then we'll be using the information from the interviews to inform the second part in the follow-up that we're going to do. Hopefully, again, looking at hierarchy as well. So trying to move in a little bit of a Q sort. and look at how people organize aspects of their identity in relation to other people and other contexts. That's the hope.
That sounds very good and interesting. I think views on hierarchy would be really interesting just on its own to look at. And I would hypothesize what one might find, but makes me think of many years ago, the sociologist Adorno, going way back, had a scale for fascism and like a fascist personality scale, thinking a question it. And deference to authority and hierarchy was a strong indicator of fascistic tendencies and so on. Yeah. So we'll do what the person above tells you and we'll impose that on the person below and so on, in a very strict way. And it's almost the opposite of that, in a sense, the anti-hierarchical perspective. So there's political elements to that as well, or how that might act out. So very interesting at where that might lead. There's another interesting aspect I think you were talking about earlier, with trauma-related responses and disassociation from, and the relationship with masking. So a lot of stims that I do now are generally below the radar of most people. So common one would be rolling up a small bit of paper in between fingers and things like this, having some very small thing to fidget with. And I realise now that, yeah, pens and so on. Yeah, it's you kind of focus on things which are socially less noticeable. And it's something I'm starting to pick up on is autistic people are perhaps masking sensory seeking behaviours in public as well, so because of the stigma of potential response. And yet these are the kinds of sensory issues which may be picked up in, say, a care home with those with significant intellectual disabilities, because they're not masking the sensory seeking or the more expressive forms of sensory needs. Yet other sensory needs, say, might be completely and utterly missed. And so this kind of differing expressions of autistic needs in different contexts and how they're read by other people. There's kind of double empathy stuff all over the place there. But the not having a narrative, though, to express oneself. So not knowing why I was doing this more than other people and hiding it and so on. Not having the words to put to it. And it makes me think of conversations around alexithymia, naming one's own emotions. But if your own emotions are differently perceived and felt and not mirrored in other people, then how are you going to have a narrative to name it? There isn't one there to draw upon, a narrative repertoire, if you like, until you start studying sociology and start naming things. But it all seems interrelated, this kind of, these issues. Yeah. Hard to unpack them. Just seen there's some comments coming through in the chat. One from Nathan. Seems the system to develop scales, questionnaires, I guess, are biased to merely accomplish what the last developer did, but differently. Scale may measure the same concept in people, but what concept that is could be debatable. Yeah, it's the framing issues around it, I think, and how it's interpreted. So I've seen things with the CAT-Q where it's interpreted in a certain way that, oh, non-autistic people rate high in the CAT-Q too, or nearly as highly. And it's like, yes, but they're not masking their autistic traits because they don't have them to mask. It's kind of, they're masking something else. And it's this lack of framing conceptually, which is why your paper, I think, was really important, sending that message out.
It is what you said earlier, Damien, about confirmation bias and kind of confirming that bias. And I think this is an issue, I think, with autism research generally, because we're, you know, still built on Asperger and Kana. Everything is framed around what they thought. Everything that's come since then has been built on what they said. So if what they said was wrong in the first place, everything that comes after logically is completely flawed. So it's inherent, not all of it, obviously there are going to be aspects of truth within it, and it's important, but there's going to be huge aspects of there that have sent people off in completely the wrong direction, which we know because also we've been missing from this narrative the whole time. And I think Nathan's right in terms of the kind of the questionnaires and stuff, and it is about confirming what they think, which is then built on what the previous person think, and then it just keeps going back and back. And if that first person was wrong in some way, then everything that comes after is going to have an aspect of wrongness to it.
Well, there's certainly elements in Asperger's work which I would say are the foundations of the theory of mind deficit idea, and probably in Kanner's too, for that matter.
Yeah.
But certainly in Asperger's work. And so would you have had that development of that theory and become so solidified and embedded without that foundation?
Mm-hmm.
And people have diverted a bit from the path, as it were, but yeah, the influence of those early writers and clinicians is still very much there, I think. Would agree. There's a message from Amy Grant here. I'm wondering if anyone's thought of bringing in Foucault's work on power and Ian Hacking on self-improvement, so how people regulate themselves to avoid critique. You want to go on that first before I do?
So I'll hold my hands up and say, like, Foucault is someone I haven't really read a lot of, but it's someone whose work that I've been trying to kind of dig into a little bit, because it also relates to some other work that I do, where power and power dynamics is quite important. But yeah, like I'm trying to branch out outside of just psychology. Like, so a lot of the things that we talked about in the paper, really interestingly, were essentially like so I came to this theory through teaching. I do first year lectures on social psychology and on identity. And I was like, this is stuff, the things that I've talked about with the first years, like Mead's work and on the generalized other, just aren't present at all. And like digging around, I mean, I think the only person I've seen who mentions it in regards to masking or kind of identity in recent work is actually you, Damien, which I think was in the a mismatch of salience.
And I think may have done, because we both mentioned Mead when we were doing that paper, so Brett may have done as well.
Yeah, so I'm trying to like, dig into sociology a bit more.
it's, I mean, Foucault is quite complicated stuff. And there's the translation issues and French philosophy and so on is quite tricky. There's postmodernist elements and so on. But I would say it's very much worth looking at. And that work on power, historically, he also looked at it in a broader scale of discourse and narrative. So more of discourse on a broader social scale, and really important stuff on the history of mental illness and the way that discourse is created, and did a book called Discipline and Punish, which was mainly about how people have been treated, and very much relates to current ATU mental health inpatients, although Goffman's work on asylums is as well. Total institutions, as he called them. Ian Hacking, who Amy also mentioned, is more a philosopher, but talked about looping effects and internalizing expectations or understandings and so on. So that gets quite complicated as well. But made an interesting point there about regulating oneself to avoid critique, which is kind of avoiding stigma as a response as well. So it might be worth looking at Hacking's work. Message from Lynn. Sometimes the autistic person may not even know they are masking. So how can be measured by a form? Will there be other ways to get more qualitative research? Yeah, forms and questionnaires are very problematic, and because it's measuring self-perceptions.
Yeah.
So, and we might perceive each other in very different ways. So one might see oneself as masking a lot, whilst the person next to you might think you're not masking very well at all, say, or what have you. So it's all subjective and self-rated, which is okay on one level, but doesn't say actually what's going on in day-to-day interactions too well. And there are lots of qualitative research methods one could apply to this in different ways. If you want to talk about that, Amy, different methods or ideas you've had there.
So we've been asking questions about masking in some of our more qualitative research, but we tend not to use the word masking. So we've asked people questions in slightly different ways, which is a really simple way of getting at something. Like, if you don't use the term that everyone's used to, but use a more general kind of question. So I'm trying to think of the exact wording we used on, I'm analysing some data at the moment on a different study, but I think we asked people like, do you feel like you can be your authentic self around other people? Tell us about context, it matters. Or do you feel like you have to please people in certain situations in order to be liked? Again, let's have some context. When do you and when don't you do this? But I'm also really keen on arts-based methodologies as well. So it's something I'm trying to work more into my own research, using things like artifacts. So asking, that's one of the things we're doing in the identity study, is asking people if they would like to submit something that represents their identity. So it can be absolutely, I say absolutely anything, like obviously you can't submit like a truck or something, but it can be like a piece of writing or an image or a painting or a song, something that you feel like represents you and core aspects of your identity. So that's one way that we've kind of been trying to get at things. I think that, like, as you said, asking people about masking, like I would have said like, oh, these experiences seem really similar to mine, but I can't mask because I'm not an autistic person, which I said about pretty much everything up until the point at which I went, oh, okay. Yeah.
I think makes me think of some methods and work around identity I was involved in about 20 years ago before I knew much at all about autism. And I was mainly working around things like trauma at the time and mental health issues, and had a friend who had a head injury, and he did a project using photographs of a photograph like a portrait, how you're viewed by bureaucracies and so on. And then there was a translucent opaque piece of paper with a written blurb by the person in the picture. You turn that over and you see how they want to identify and how they see themselves in a different photograph. There was a whole book just made of that as a photography project. It was quite lovely seeing the mixture of pictures you get of how people have just expressed their own identities. And that kind of creative identity kind of work, I think, is really powerful in terms of trauma research, and there's a huge amount of crossover, of course. So could be some interesting work there.
I think that's why as well, it's so much more powerful to look at this through so many different lenses, because when you're looking, we know that there's an issue in psychology that psychologists don't talk to anybody else. Everything stays within the remit of psychology. Nothing else exists. Yeah, tunnel vision. And I've been talking a lot when I've been doing like talks and stuff on this about, rather than seeing it as concealment, and more about projecting acceptability depending on who you're with. So, because it's very much the narrative at the moment is around kind of it's us hiding, when in actual fact it might not be. You might have an autistic person that exaggerates themselves, and that's not hiding. That's putting out there what people expect to see of them in order to fulfill that confirmation bias of those people. So I think we need to look at this in a much, much bigger picture and from as many different angles as possible, because you can't get to the root of someone's existence through a series of questions and then breaking that off into a questionnaire. I don't think it's possible to do that.
Yeah, I think it's way too in-depth topic, and there's going to be much variety in how people react and respond in different contexts. It makes more qualitative type methods and theories are needed. Just trying to look at there's lots of messages coming through.
Some questions in the Q&A as well. There's one here from Nathan about whether the impact of masking is greater for autistic people compared to non-autistic people. Based on the paper that we had come out recently, I wouldn't say that the masking is great. I would say it's different in the ways that we might expect it to be different depending on what you're masking. But I think the idea that like autistic masking is this special kind of masking that's so very different from other marginalized people is probably quite ableist, and is again used to kind of set autistic people apart, instead of looking at the underlying thing which drives the masking, which is that societal stigma. So autistic people might respond to that in ways that interact with their autistic ways of being, and they might have different coping strategies or coping mechanisms, but I don't necessarily think it's greater. I just think it's compounded by a lot of other things that happen, and other forms of minority stress. So, being stigmatized by other people a lot is probably going to mean that
just the level of stigma in a sense, and problems socially, and being stigmatized in social interaction itself. I think Goffman would have had some words about in terms of that double whammy thing. of not being able to manage your interactions the way you should be. However, there's other forms of stigma and discrimination in this society which are pretty horrendous, and intersecting discriminations and so on as well. So, and I wouldn't be able to know what it's like, double empathy type issues, to be in the position that many marginalized people are in. And what that tells me is people need to be humble and learn from others, and know that however much you learn, you're never going to experience what it's like to be something you're not. And that humility towards, in practice, towards autistic people is often not there. And I think a lot of the theories around theory of mind and so on have made that worse, have made assumptions and expectations and where the problem lies, and increases the stigma, let alone extreme male brain stuff. Another point. Yeah, kind of made that even worse. But
It's okay though, because we've got the extreme female brain now, haven't we? So.
Oh God.
really, is that?
The female autism phenotype.
Oh, I mean, that's just as bad in a way.
Yeah.
No, I think that's been problematic from its outset, and as an idea, it's just far too essentializing gender for one, and given the gender non-conforming ways of autistic people, it just seems a bit just totally missing the point in a way. And I think it's interesting why it may be the case autistic women are masking at higher levels, perhaps, or it's come across as more notable, or less autistic women being diagnosed and so on, and these related factors. But why that might be the case is far more nuanced, even on a general level, than what people are saying. Someone's saying, Dave, humour is often a highly successful way of simultaneously gaining acceptance, reducing some context switching, and using aspects of autistic perception in the mainstream. Humour can backfire. Got to be careful with that one. Out of context humour can be you're more in trouble.
Yeah. Like, I think, yeah, I've definitely been there. Lynn's asked whether we'll be researching autistic children and looking at masking in younger children. It's something sorry, our coffee machine just turned itself off, which is probably a good thing. But we would very much like to. So Kieran and I last week had a bit of a discussion around this off the basis of the back of something else and annoying us both, which is usually the case. And we have an idea for something we would like to do that involves arts-based methods with kids. So yeah, we have some ideas of things we would like to look at. I think there's definitely, yeah, I don't want to, I certainly don't want to, not legitimize your fear, but amp that up. But there is, I think that is a legitimate issue, is that a lot of what I'm seeing, at least in the research that I'm analysing at the moment, is that trauma does play a bloody big role in masking and people feeling like they're masking unconsciously like the invalidation that people experience early on in childhood really is having a lifelong impact. It's not a little kind of side note of, oh, this might be a confound or something that like we should look at, but it seems to be a really major issue for a lot of people. So yeah, I think we do need to look at it on a developmental scale, because it's not something that just pops into appearance in adolescence or in adulthood. And I mean, we talked about that before, didn't we? Because we went to a talk by someone else who talked about some data suggesting that autistic, well, they said that the data suggests that autism appears in girls in adolescence, and maybe for girls they become autistic in adolescence. And I was like, that's the most ridiculous thing I've heard this week, but not ever. But Kieran and I were looking at the graph and we were like, is that not just suggesting that girls are starting to mask at a different point than boys? Because that's how we would have interpreted that based on what the data points looked like. So yeah.
But again, that Amy comes back to what I was saying earlier about it's very easy to blame everything on masking. And in actual fact, I mean, Lynn's question there, kind of that reflect on what you were just talking about, that talk that we went to reflects back on the fact that there is a significant amount of knowledge missing from the people around the autistic person. So then it's very easy to say, you know, oh, like my child goes to school and they mask all day. In actual fact, they're probably not. Probably most of us who are autistic people could go into that environment and probably spot them because they're not hiding. They're very visible to us because we know what we're looking for. Whereas other people in that environment either don't know what they're looking for, or it's not on the conscious part of their brain to be looking for those things. And it's so this is why, again, it's a much bigger issue and a much bigger narrative than everything being blamed on us, because there is a massive part of victim blaming around all of this.
Reminds me of a story. Once I was visiting a school for autistic children, and the head teacher or deputy head was showing me around and showed from a distance different classes and what they were doing, and showed me some children that they said, oh, these children here have significant sensory needs and we're doing this, that and the other with them. Then took me to another classroom, and as they were opening the door, suggested this bunch of children there don't really have sensory needs to the same extent. First young person I saw in the room had a pen holding down like that and spinning a piece of paper underneath it. I was like, are you sure about this? I think it's these children in this room, within a second of walking in, well, there's some sensory needs here. I think you'll find. And yeah, they're clearly not masking whatsoever. And this interpretive difference and not understanding the autistic way of being and experiencing the world does cause a lot of these issues. So when, as Lynn said there, at secondary school, when they say the child is fine, often what they mean is the child is not kicking off. The child is quiet.
Can I jump in, guys? I've just been informed by Jill we need to wrap up.
Yeah, I wanted to go over time, obviously, because of the start, and give you enough time for discussion. And there's some really good questions, though, there. There's another one which would be good to discuss. So
I'm just going to share the slide for next time as a save the date.
We'll have to carry these discussions on,
definitely,
on social media and events in the future. I'd just like to thank everyone for